The Bullionist Attack on Foreign Exchange and on the East India Trade, by Murray N. Rothbard. Having survived the assaults of ignorant moralists before the Reformation, the foreign exchange market was subjected during the far more secular age of the late 16th century onwards to the assaults of regulators on behalf of the nation-state. Writers who have been misnamed Bullionists adopted the ignorant view that an outflow of gold or silver bullion abroad was iniquitous, and that this calamity was brought about by the machinations of evil foreign exchange dealers, who deliberately sought gain by depreciating the value of the nation's currency. Nowhere was there any insight that the outflow of bullion might have been performing an economic function, or was the result of underlying supply and demand forces. Despite their insights into Gresham's law and debasement, Thomas Smith and Gresham would have to be placed in the Bullionist category. The policy conclusion of the Bullionists was all too simple. The state should outlaw the export of bullion and should severely regulate or even nationalize the foreign exchange market. The exchange dealers battled back with sensible and powerful arguments. Thus, in 1576, they argued in A Protest Against the State Control of Exchange Business that state intervention would cause a drying up of commerce. On the low value of the English pound, they replied that we can say nothing but that our exchanges are made with a mutual consent between merchant and merchant, and that abundance of the deliveries or of the takers make the exchange rise and fall. One prominent bullionist of the early 17th century was Thomas Mills, circa 1550 to circa 1627. In a series of tracts from 1601 to 1611, Mills advances the old bullionist position. Foreign exchange transactions, Mills opined, were evil. They were institutions with which private merchants and bankers, covetous persons whose end is private gain, rule in the place of kings. Something new, however, had been added. For the powerful East India Company had been chartered in 1600 to monopolize all trade with the Far East and the Indies. The East India trade was unique in that Europeans purchased a great deal of valuable muslins and spices, but the Indies in turn bought very little from Europe except gold and silver. European nations, therefore, had an unfavorable balance of trade with the Far East, and the India trade therefore quickly became a favorite target for mercantilist writers. Not only were goods being imported from the East as against few exports, but specie, bullion, seemed to flow eternally eastwards. Mills therefore took up the bullionist cudgels by calling for restriction or prohibition of the Indies trade, and attacking the activities of the East India Company. Mills was also eager to intensify regulations against the merchant adventurers, the governmentally privileged monopoly for the export of woolen cloth to the Netherlands. Instead, he craved a return to the old privileged raw wool export monopoly of the merchant staple. In fact, Mills went so far as to call the old regulated staple trade the first step towards heaven. It is certainly likely that Mills' eagerness to regulate and prohibit foreign trade and bullion flows was connected with his own occupation as customs official. The more regulation, the more work and power for Thomas Mills. Stung to the quick, the secretary of the merchant adventurers, John Wheeler, circa 1553 to 1611, replied to Mills' charges in his Treatise of Commerce in 1601. Wheeler upheld the orderly competition of the 3,500 merchant members joined together in the privileged monopoly, as against the unorganized, dispersed, straggling, and promiscuous trade of free competition. He also engaged in semantic trickery by asserting that monopoly by definition means only single seller. Hundreds of merchants linked together into a privileged export company were able, after all, to act virtually as one privileged firm. In Wheeler's own words, these merchants were united and held together by their good government, and by their politic and merchant-like orders, backed up, we must not forget, by the armed might of the state. Sneering at the idea of free competition, Wheeler smugly opined that any merchant who loses a little liberty will be better off being restrained in that estate than if he were left to his own greedy appetite. When John Cale, over a decade later in The Trade's Increase, 1615, protested that the monopoly of the merchant adventurers would unjustly keep others out forever, his pamphlet was suppressed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he earned a stint in jail for his pains. Later, in the 1650s, Thomas Violet had a Mills-type motive for special pleading in his call for prohibition of the export of bullion. Violet had been a professional searcher and government informer seeking out violations of the law prohibiting the export of bullion. Now, in A True Discovery to the Commons of England, 1651, he sought to reinstate that good old law, and he accompanied his call for reinstatement of bullion prohibition with a request that he himself be employed once again to seek out violators, to the embarrassing fact that he, Violet, had himself been convicted and punished for violating these very provisions. He countered with a ready quip, "An old deer-stealer is the best keeper of a park." The most distinguished bullionist of the early 17th century was Gerard de Malines, died 1641. Malines was a Fleming born in Antwerp to the prominent Van Mechelen family, probably changing his name to Malines when he emigrated to London in the 1580s, perhaps in response to the Spanish persecution of Protestants in the Netherlands in that era. Malines was listed as an alien in the records of that period and as a member of the Dutch Protestant Church. He is also depicted in the records as a merchant stranger, that is, as a merchant from abroad. Malines turned out to be a speculator and an unscrupulous, even crooked businessman, embezzling money from his Dutch business associates. He was often on the verge of bankruptcy, and his partner and father-in-law, the Antwerp-born Willem Vermuyden, died in debtor's prison. Malines, nonetheless, was a linguist and highly educated scholar, deeply interested in literature, the Latin language, mathematics, and classical Greek philosophy. He was also well versed in scholastic doctrine. A member of a royal commission of 1600 to study economic problems, Malines began his bullionist writings in 1601, in particular a treatise on the canker of England's Commonwealth, and published many tracts on into the 1620s. Like Gresham and the 16th century bullionists, Malines fulminated against the foreign exchange dealers, asserting superficially and incorrectly that exchange rates were set by willful conspiracies of exchange dealers. Malines was more rigorous than previous bullionists. Instead of institutions to control exchange dealings, he advocated a government bank, which would enjoy a monopoly on all foreign exchange transactions. Intertwined with his star-crossed business career was Malines' service in government, becoming at various times a top bureaucrat at the Royal Mint and a financial advisor to the Crown. Malines also had a personal stake in the revival of rigorous exchange control, for he himself eagerly anticipated filling the resurrected post of Royal Exchanger. To Malines, there was a just exchange rate at the legal par, and the government's task was to enforce it. In an earlier tract in 1601, St. George for England allegorically described, Malin, harking back to an old theme, denounced foreign exchange dealings as usury, and expressed the hope that by tight control this usury could die a gradual death. To advocate rigorous exchange control, Malin, of course, had to deny that the foreign exchange market could in any way equilibrate or regulate itself, or that exchange rates were set by supply and demand forces. To Malin goes the dubious credit for the emergence of the spurious and pernicious terms of trade fallacy. This doctrine argues that a balance of trade deficit and export of bullion will not regulate itself. For higher foreign exchange rates and cheaper domestic currency will not, as one might believe, spur exports and retard imports. Instead, the unfavorable terms of trade of, say, the pound in terms of foreign currency will lead to even more imports and fewer exports, thus driving more bullion out of the country. Even if a cheaper pound will bring in less foreign exchange revenue, a highly unlikely event seen more often in armchair speculation than in practice, one wonders where the English would continue to find either foreign currency or specie to pay for the higher-priced foreign products. Surely the specie would eventually run out, and for that reason alone, some market mechanism would have to come into play to restrict foreign imports or the export of specie. Thus Malin managed to take the absurd position that whatever happens in the foreign exchange market, specie will keep flowing out of England. Flowing out if the pound should be expensive, since this will restrict exports and encourage imports, a correct insight, but also flowing out if the reverse happens, because of the terms of trade argument. The specie outflow was therefore blamed on the metaphysical malevolence of the exchange dealers, and it could only be cured by severe government control, including prohibition of the export of bullion. Malin also advocated control of the exchange rate at the legal mint par, which would mean, in the context of the time, a substantial appreciation or higher value of the pound sterling. Yet, continuing in the faulty terms of trade mode, Malin saw no problem of specie outflow from such a marked appreciation of the currency. In fact, he hailed the higher domestic prices that would supposedly draw more specie into the country. In a similar bizarre twist, Malin, correctly noting that the inflationary influx of specie from the New World had hit the other countries of Western Europe before coming into England, yet concluded this was a terrible event for England. For instead of realizing that lower prices made English goods more competitive abroad, Malin concluded that these unfavorable terms of trade put England into a poor competitive position and led to a permanent outflow of specie. In view of his record in propounding tissues of egregious fallacies, it is curious that Malin has had a good press among historians of economic thought, even among those who disagree with his basic outlook. They seem to laud him for recognizing that prices vary directly with the quantity of money, so that a country losing gold will find its prices falling, whereas a country accumulating gold will see its prices rise. But Malin, eager to indict the workings of international prices and exchanges rather than explain how they work, was scarcely willing to develop the full implication of his occasional insights. Furthermore, considering that this quantity theory had long been known and developed and integrated for centuries by the Spanish scholastics, Baudin, and others, Malin's achievements seem dubious at best. The East India apologists strike back. England suffered a severe recession in the early 1620s, and Gerard Moline returned to the attack, publishing a series of tracts repeating his well-known views and calling for stringent measures to curb the merchant adventurers and especially the East India Company, as well as any other traders who dared to export bullion from the kingdom. His influence was bolstered by having been a member of the Royal Commission on the Exchanges in 1621. Taking up the torch in defense of the merchant adventurers was one of its members, Edward Misselden, died 1654. In a tract entitled Free Trade, or the Means to Make Trade Flourish, 1622, following service on a Privy Council Committee of Inquiry on the Depression of Trade, Misselden advanced somewhat beyond Moline's analysis. He acknowledged that bullion was exported from England, not due to the machinations of wicked exchange dealers, but from imports exceeding exports, from what would later be called an unfavorable balance of trade. Misselden, then, was not concerned with regulating the exchanges, but he did want the state to force a favorable balance into being by subsidizing exports, restricting or prohibiting imports, and cracking down on the export of bullion. In short, he called for the usual set of mercantilist measures. Misselden was largely concerned to defend his merchant adventurers. Like Wheeler, a generation earlier, he maintained that his company was not at all a monopolist, but simply the organization of orderly and structured competition. Besides, wrote Misselden, his merchant adventurers exported cloth to Europe, and therefore fitted in with the interests of England. The truly evil firm was the privileged East India Company, which had a decidedly unfavorable balance of trade of its own with the Indies, and which continually exported bullion abroad. Misselden now entered into a series of angry pamphlet debates with Moline, who replied in the same year with the maintenance of free trade. Neither party, of course, had the slightest interest in what would now be called free trade. In 1623, Misselden accepted a post as deputy governor of the merchant adventurers in Holland, perhaps as a reward for his stirring defense of the company in the public prints. But in addition, the East India Company, seeing in Misselden an effective champion and a troublesome foe, made him a member, and one of their commissioners in Holland during the same year. As a result, when his second pamphlet, The Circle of Commerce, was published in 1623, Misselden displayed a miraculous change of heart. For the East India Company had been suddenly transformed from villain to hero. Misselden, quite sensibly, now pointed out that while the East India Company did export specie in exchange for products from the Indies, it can and does re-export these goods in exchange for specie. The outstanding defender of the East India Company in the early 17th century was one of its prominent directors, Sir Thomas Munn, 1571 to 1641. Munn was early engaged as a merchant in the Mediterranean trade, especially with Italy and the Middle East. In 1615, Munn was elected a director of the East India Company, and after that he spent his life in actively promoting its interests. He entered the lists on behalf of the company in 1621 with his tract, A Discourse of Trade from England unto the East Indies. The following year, he and Misselden were both members of the Privy Council Committee of Inquiry. Munn's second and major work, England's Treasure by Foreign Trade, or The Balance of Foreign Trade is the Rule of Our Treasure, taking a broader view of the economy, was written about 1630 and published posthumously by Munn's son John in 1664. When published, it carried the stamp of approval of Henry Bennet, Secretary of State in the Restoration government, and also an architect of England's mercantilist policy against the Dutch. The pamphlet was highly influential and was reprinted in several editions, the last being published in 1986. Thomas Munn set forth what would become the standard mercantilist line. He pointed out that there was nothing particularly evil about the East India Company trade. The company imported valuable drugs, spices, dyes, and cloth from the Indies, and it re-exported most of these products to other countries. Overall, in fact, the company had actually imported more specie than it had exported. In any case, the focus of English policy should not be on the specific trade of one company or with one country, but on the overall or general balance of trade. There it must make sure that the country exports more than it purchases from abroad, thereby also increasing the wealth of the nation. As Munn succinctly put it at the beginning of England's Treasure, the ordinary means to increase our wealth and treasure is by foreign trade, wherein we must ever observe this rule, to sell more to strangers yearly than we consume of theirs in value. To that end, Munn advocated sumptuary laws banning consumption of imported goods, protective tariffs and subsidies and directives to consume domestic manufactures. Munn, on the other hand, opposed any direct restrictions on the export of bullion, such as conducted by the East India Company. Munn was wise enough in combating the fallacies of Moline and Misselden. Against Moline, he pointed out that the movements of the exchange rate reflect not the manipulations of bankers and dealers, but the supply and demand of currencies. That which causes an under- or overvaluing of monies by exchange is the plenty or scarcity thereof. Misselden had advocated debasement of the currency as a means of increasing the price level. Such increase, Misselden had argued in pre-Keynesian fashion, will be abundantly recompensed unto all in the plenty of money and quickening of trade in every man's hand. As a leader of the merchant adventurers, Misselden was undoubtedly highly interested in the spur that debasement would give to exports. But Munn denounced debasement, first as bringing confusion by changing the measure of value, and second by increasing prices all around. If the common measure be changed, our lands, leases, wares both foreign and domestic, must alter in proportion. Neither did Munn bend his energies towards an export surplus because he was enamored of the idea of accumulating specie in England. Adhering to the quantity theory of money, Munn realized that such accumulation would simply drive prices up, which would not only be to no avail, but would discourage exports. Munn wanted to accumulate specie not for its own sake, not to drive up prices at home, but to drive trade, to increase foreign trade still further. An expansion of foreign trade per se seems to be Thomas Munn's main objective, and this overriding goal is not very puzzling from a leader of the great East India Company. Furthermore, foreign trade, for Thomas Munn fully as much as for Montaigne, increased the national power, as well as the power of English traders, at the expense of other nations. England and her inhabitants only wax great at the expense of foreigners. As Munn put it succinctly, in trade, one man's necessity becomes another man's opportunity, and one man's loss is another man's gain. In an odd prefigurement of the Keynesian view that national debt held at home is immaterial because we only owe it to ourselves, Munn and his fellow mercantilists considered internal trade unimportant because there we only transfer wealth among ourselves. The export balance in foreign trade then becomes of crucial importance, so that the export merchant becomes by far the most productive occupation in the economy. That Munn was far from being a primitive inflationist is seen by the scorn he properly and contemptuously heaped upon the common plea and favorite mercantilist complaint that business and the economy were suffering from a scarcity of money. The conclusion invariably drawn from such analysis is that the government was duty-bound to do something quickly to augment the money stock. Munn wittily riposted in his Discourse of Trade, "Concerning the evil or want of silver, I think it hath been and is a general disease of all nations, and so will continue until the end of the world. For poor and rich complain they never have enough. But it seems that the malady is grown mortal here with us, and therefore it cries out for remedy. Well, I hope it is but imagination maketh us sick, when all our parts be sound and strong." Thomas Munn may have been the most prominent and sophisticated of the early 17th century mercantilists in England. Yet, as Schumpeter points out, these were all pamphleteers, not particularly interested in analysis of the economy, special pleaders rather than aspiring scientists. Perhaps the best economic analyst of all in this period was Rice Vaughan, whose A Discourse of Coin and Coinage, though published in 1675, was written in the mid-1620s. Vaughan, in the first place, held that the disappearance of silver during this period was the effect of what we now call Gresham's Law, the bimetallic undervaluation by the English government of silver as against gold. Since silver, rather than gold, was the money for most transactions, this undervaluation had a certain deflationary effect. In the course of his tract, Vaughan pointed out that an export surplus will not have the desired effect of bringing precious metals into the kingdom if the value of the gold or silver pound in England is low in terms of purchasing power. For then, goods will be imported instead of the monetary metals, and the export surplus will disappear. Vaughan was also astute enough to recognize that prices do not all move together when the value of money changes. For example, that domestic prices usually lag behind the debasement or devaluation of money standards. Most importantly, Rice Vaughan remarkably harked back to the scholastic continental subjective utility and scarcity tradition in the determination of the values and prices of goods. Vaughan concisely pointed out that the value of a good is dependent on its subjective utility, and hence demand by consumers. Use and delight, or the opinion of them, are the true causes why all things have a value and price set upon them, while the actual price is determined by the interaction of this subjective utility with the relative scarcity of the good. The proportion of that value and price is wholly governed by rarity and abundance. The Ludwig von Mises Institute hopes you have enjoyed this audio Mises Daily. For a world of free market literature, media, and discussion, visit Mises.org.